I want to talk a little bit about this piece. A lot of folks have been looking at it. First of all, I did not cut this apart. There are many weeks of work in this piece, and it was in a museum out in Nebraska, and the grade school kids came to visit, and they got roughhousing and knocked over the pedestal on the piece and broke it. The insurance company paid the museum for it, and the museum gave me the pieces back, which was pretty cool because the other one's a little more than this one, and I can make a wall hanging out of it. But I want to talk about the process. Besides the turning that we're going to do today, everybody's interested, a lot of people are interested in these techniques. This piece is representative of a little town in Mexico called Loreto, and it's on the Sea Cortez. It's a little sport fishing village, and this pattern is actually the pattern of the bricks in the street there. And this image on here is the town hall. Now, we were in that town, and I just took the camera and pointed it down the street and took a photograph of the bricks, and they became the basis of this pattern. And to put this pattern on here, the entire piece was masked with a liquid masking that we'll talk about this afternoon, assuming we have time. And then all of the points that are located on here were laid out as lines, so this looked like a crazy plaid on here. You really couldn't figure out where anything was, and I took a green Sharpie and just picked out one of these bricks and outlined it, and then the next one and the next one and so on until they were all outlined. And then each one was individually cut out with an X-Acto knife, and when it was cut out, the brick was airbrushed. And you just keep doing that around the piece until you get it all done. And then all of these little squares, the masking, of course, for those was still on there. That was pulled off. Then the piece, a couple more coats of varnish are put on there. This is all varnish, by the way. There's no lacquer on any of my pieces. And the varnish, a couple more coats of varnish were put on and sanded back. And then it's ready for the next operation, which in this case was to outline these bricks by hand with sepia ink. I went over each one of these lines 3 times to make them uneven so they look like, bricks that are not real perfect. I'll show you the equipment that I use to draw these very precise lines on the pieces and a couple of those pieces over there. And the images up here, this is Silverleaf, and the way that this image was made is, again, the photograph of the town hall was taken into Photoshop and brought to maximum contrast in black and white, and then was printed in inverse on a laser printer, placed face down on here. And if you use acetone or MEK, either of those solvents will melt the toner, and the toner then is deposited onto the surface of the silver. The process is very difficult to control, so each image comes out different because sometimes the toner gets too much solvent and it just blobs, and sometimes it doesn't get enough solvent, doesn't transfer. So every image is different, which I kind of like. And once you have the toner on there, the acid was airbrushed onto the surface of the silver, and then when the reaction gets to the point where you want it to stop, you put baking soda and water on there to stop the action. And then you clean all that off and take Q-tips and start cleaning off all the toner and exposing the silver. So it's a pretty simple process to create the whole piece. You can. One more thing I might mention right now, because I know some people have to leave, but the finish that you see on all of my pieces is varnish. I don't use lacquer because of the flammability of it. It's the vapors that are used in lacquer have very high flash points and create explosive atmospheres very easily unless you have the proper kinds of equipment to take care of that. It's very dangerous. Plus, those vapors are much more hazardous to your health than the vapors from varnish. So that's why I developed the method of using varnish. The varnish I use is very common. It's Minwax Helmsman Spar Urethane, and I brought an empty can over there so everybody can see it. It's available from Lowe's, Menards, Home Depot, Walmart, probably your local Ace Hardware store, and a lot of other places. There are 2 things that are very important, and this finish that you see is just that varnish right off of a foam brush. There's no buffing, there's no rubbing or anything else that's done on this finish. That's just the way it ends up. Smart ass answer, as many as it takes. In this case, now here's the reason why I answer like that. In this case, there are lots and lots of coats because there are coats over each operation. So you seal each operation with more coats. On one of those pieces over there, sorry Clyde, it didn't mean to be flipped like that, but on those pieces over there, some of them would have only 2 coats of varnish. So it just depends on what you're doing with the piece. There are 2 things that are really important, maybe more than 2. First of all, you use a foam brush and you don't buy the brush at Walmart. You buy a Gen, J-E-N, made in USA foam brush. It's a gray and it's a really fine foam. I buy them, actually I get them from a place here in Wisconsin, an art supply place. You go on the internet and you can find them for a fairly decent price. And while I don't like the idea that foam brushes are not necessarily environmentally good, it also is not good for the environment to be using a lot of mineral spirits or whatever you want to use and clean the brush and throw that away. So it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. So I use the foam brushes. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all today is we're going to talk about the deep hollowing process, and we're going to try to show as much of that as we can, and it happens in 2 stages. We start with the green wood and we do a rough out a vessel, and then after that's dried we do a second turning, which is almost the same thing all over again. This piece I'm not going to take it back off of there. This piece has the pith in the middle, so it's the same all the way around. And when you're doing hollow vessels like this, bear in mind that if you took a piece out of the side of a log and tried to do this with it, it'd be like a bowl. When it dried, it would go oval, and you would have to leave it very, very thick. Or when you went back to turn it the second time, you would go through it on 2 sides before you got down to the other 2 sides. So I always have the pith in the middle of these, and they will dry fairly equally. I also look for the plainest wood I can find. Now, it's really easy to go to all these symposiums and trade shows and magazines and everywhere else and buy all the fancy wood in the world you want. But when you call some wood supplier up and say, I want a piece of hard maple with no knots, no figure, I want it as plain as it can be, and I want it green, I want it cut today, I want to turn it today. You know, that does not compute. Right? It is very difficult for us to find that wood. Hard maple, it's only if you can turn it right away, get it through the summer, that's okay, but if you can't turn it right away, you better wait until about this time of year before you harvest it. Otherwise, you're going to have blue stain in it within 2 weeks of the time you cut it. And that doesn't generally look very good. So when you look at this piece, you're trying to determine what's going to be top and what's going to be bottom. There are some knots. There are 3 little knots right here, another little tiny one right there that probably won't go in very far. So this is going to be the bottom of my vessel, and this is going to be the top. Yes, sir?
What happens to the maple if you give it?
Blue stain. It's the beginning of the decay process, and it's kind of a blue-gray color that you'll see in the wood, and it's pretty ugly, and bleach does not take it out. Back to this. Now we've decided what's going to be top and bottom. We want to prepare this to be turned around in the lathe so that we're going to grab this end with the chuck, and we need to put a foot in there that the chuck will work with. And I'm going to real quick turn this down a little ways. By the way, if you buy unhandled tools, make your own handles, ebony is a really great wood for that, especially if you don't have anything else to do with the ebony. Turn that down a little bit, and then we're going to plane that end off or face that end off so that it's flat on the end. That just means it's going to sit as it sits around between now and the time that it's ever finished, you can set it down flat. And this tool is just a piece of 1/4-inch square metal lathe bit, high-speed steel, and it's just glued into a scrap piece of walnut, a little piece of copper pipe here for a ferrule. And the angle it's on here is the angle of the inside of the jaws of the chuck. And we're going to create a, can I use that to draw on? We're going to create a little place for the chuck jaws to grab, and the reason we're going to do that, we could obviously just stick this in the chuck and clamp down on it. So if we had a piece of wood here, and if we just clamp down on it and we push those chuck jaws down in here like this, what we would do is we would crush this wood down here and tear it. And you can see that by disturbing all of those fibers, what we've done is created some weakness here. And the important thing about these chucks is that this face right here, or the end of this, has to fit the outside or go up tight against the outside edge of this chuck. You don't ever want this bottom to bottom out in those jaws. So what you do is you create that little place like that, and now your chuck jaws go in like that, and you get a nice solid mount for the chuck. And that's what we're going to do right now. So this is that angle. We're just going to go in here a little ways. I'm just going to run up here. If I could reach it, I would. I'm just going to run up here and make a little bit of a cut right there just to kind of define that edge, because I'm going to knock that off there later. I'm not going to bother with it today, but I'll knock it off with a chisel later on. Now, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to take another metal lathe working bit. This one happens to be a 1/2-inch square by 8 inches long. Again, some scrap walnut, and this time a brass ferrule. And we just knock the edge off here to put a nice little scraping edge. And we're going to create the foot of the vessel. Now, we're going to use a center steady eventually when we get to hollow this, so we don't have to leave a lot of wood down here. There's a big advantage to using a center steady in that other methods of deep hollowing often use a faceplate, and you got to leave a lot of wood down here to keep everything solid out here, and you have to work your way down from the top as you're hollowing. The problem with that is when you get there, you're there, and the shape you've got is what you've got. You can't change it at that point. If you screwed the shape up, you're just done. If you use a center steady, you can do the entire exterior shape of the piece, even down to a thin bottom hollowing process. Now, I always say that you can, remember we were talking about the wood suppliers that have all the nice exotic wood. You can go out and buy the most beautiful piece of wood in the entire world. And if you put a bad shape on it, you've got a piece of junk. Whereas on the other hand, you can go out and get the plainest piece of wood in the world, and you put a beautiful shape in it, you've got a museum piece. Line and form are everything, okay? So the center steady allows us to get there. Now I'm going to go in with this scraper, and I'm going to go in just a little ways, like I went about 1/8 of an inch there or so, and I'm going to tip the scraper a little bit, and going to go in again, and I'm going to keep doing that, widening that out, because there is no relief ground on this scraper. And I know what happens from experience if you don't widen that out. This gets drawn in underneath, and it's really hard on these knuckles up here. In fact, I don't even like to put my knuckles up there because they can be something else. Speaking of knuckles, I should probably talk about while I happen to think of it. If you buy a chuck, when you buy the chuck, all of these little points around the chuck here, all of these little corners are going to be very sharp. The first thing you should do before you ever mount it on your lathe is take a file or a little grinder or something and round off all of these sharp corners. Because if you don't do that, it's going to take you a lifetime to wear them down that way with your knuckles. So I'm going to, while I've got this on the lathe, and before I turn it, I could turn it around right now because I have a foot, I have the tang. I want this tang, this little drive tang here to be as small in diameter as possible, but still enough to apply the power through the rest of the process. The smaller we make this, the less likely this piece is to crack, and the faster it will dry. And by the way, when we were talking about taking a piece of wood out of the side of a log, it's also important that the smaller, the thinner it is, the faster it will dry, and the less likely it is to crack. So if you made it thicker to accommodate that oval, then you would be far more likely to lose the piece in the long run. So I'm just going to take some of the wood off of here while it's mounted up here. On a piece this small, it doesn't really matter so much, but when we do big pieces, they can weigh 450 pounds when we have them at this point on the lathe. So we like to get close to the shape before we take them off and turn them around. It makes that a little bit easier. You just kind of get into that. I'm going to make a simple shape, excuse me, on this one. I'm not going to really try to do my traditional shape. And by the way, the shape that you see on all those pieces, there are a couple of signature elements that define my work. If you walk into an instant gallery in one of the national symposiums or something, those of us have been, I mean, there are people in this room that have been around this long enough, you could walk in there and without ever going over and looking at name tags, you could say, there's the work of so-and-so, there's the work of so-and-so, there's the work of so. The thing, if you want to do that, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you really think you want to do that, there are three elements that need to be taken care of, and that's your name and your face and your work. And your objective is to get to the point where if somebody sees your face, they know your name and your work. They see your work, they know your name and your face, and so on. So that's what you got to shoot for. That means you got to spend a lot of time and money going places and being places, and doing things that aren't necessarily bad. It can be a heck of a lot of fun. I've been to parties in penthouses in Grosvenor Square in Washington, D.C., where this little boy from Nebraska would never, ever have had a chance of being if it weren't for this. And a lot of other places and things like that that were pretty cool. When Dalmano Gallery was having some problems and about looking like they were going to go bankrupt, which they eventually did, I gave them a letter and said that all the money you owe me and all is forgiven. You don't owe me a thing, and all the pieces that you have of mine right now are yours to do with as you please. And the reason I did that is because I knew they were in trouble, and they hadn't paid a lot of their artists for a long time. And as far as I'm concerned, the ride they gave me, I could never, ever have purchased at any price. It was pretty cool, but that's kind of over with now. No, I'm glad. Excellent question. You can see that I've got, there are people that will tell you you've got to have that chuck just right there. And I won't argue that you'll get the maximum grip that way. But for what we're doing right here, this is fine. Anything that will fit into this chuck is fine. It'll work just great. Again, it's more important that this face of the chuck go against that ridge that we created right there. That's the important thing, those two. And you'll note here, if you can see, I don't know if this shows or not, but you can see that there's a gap. See? Okay. There's a gap right here between the bottom of this piece and the back, the inside of this chuck face here. I hate to say that I've done this and it's never come apart. You know, I did a demo for our chapter one night. We got to this place. You know, somebody said something about that, about the same sort of thing. And I said, you know, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never ever had one come out of the lathe. The only saving grace was the guy that usually videotapes our presentations wasn't there that night, so it's not on tape. It came out. Yeah, I used the excuse that another guy had actually put it in the lathe, and which was true, but he had put it in the lathe correctly. So that was not a legitimate excuse. But anyway, so I didn't get this exactly centered. You can see it, we got a little run out here. So we'll just kind of correct that and get our shape to where we want it. Yeah. By the way, if you're just learning, you're going to see me switch hands. And if you're just learning to turn, don't learn either left hand or right hand. Learn them both as long as you're learning it. Because if you can't switch back and forth, you're going to be severely handicapped. You're only going to be able to do 50% of the moves that you otherwise would be able to do. I'm just trying to get this square right here, or flat across here, to start with. And let me take a little more of this off, I guess, with this yet. Now I'm going to create a little runway here. We're going to use a center steady on this, as I mentioned before. And one thing about light colored wood, like maple, for example, and some others, where those, we use hard wheels down there. We use hard wheels on our center steadies, and we use hard wheels because they don't allow vibration. The roller blade wheels that are often used on center steadies, if you take your thumbnail press in, you're going to find that they give a little bit. So if you're using that for this, it can also give a little bit in the wood, cause vibration as you're trying to hollow the piece out. So the hard wheels will actually kind of mash some of these fibers on the outside here and redistribute the glue that holds those fibers together, glue so to speak. And then when the piece dries, they'll dry a different color than the rest of the piece. So you'll have this ring around it. And that can go in almost 1/8 of an inch. So in order to avoid that with this piece, what we're going to do is just take arbitrarily and make a little band there. We'll make sure that it's running true and is parallel to the axis of the lathe. There's the one I want right there. And then we'll finish up this shape. And there's another cut here that you can use that's kind of tricky. If you do this cut here, be very, very careful that you hold on and turn. You're rubbing the bevel, turn until you just pick that cut up. Because if you turn just a few degrees more, you're going to get a really, really nasty catch. And we'll come over here and do this side. Now, I have a couple of things down here. First of all, the bottom of this vessel is kind of rough because I used a scraper to go in. I want to correct that because that's torn grain, and it's not going to be good on the bottom of the vessel. And you can see that if I tried to go in here with this gouge, that I would immediately hit this chuck before I got very far at all. So there's a solution to that, which is, you can see the difference in the bevels on these two. Maybe if I can't. All right, let me just say that the bevel on this piece right here is about like that, and on this gouge, and the bevel on this gouge is like this. So this one, in order to get this bevel perpendicular with the axis of the lathe, I would have to go clear over here like that. But since this bevel is so much longer, I can take this and actually pick that cut up right here and swing it around. And as I go in here, I want to be sure this, so I'm going to pick that up again. I can go in all the way in to the center like that, and we now have a cut bottom on that. Although I can see, I should have taken the, yeah, I can see that I did not get it quite flat, so I'm going to go back in and do that. I can use the edge of this gouge kind of like a scraper to take off a little bit of a knuckle I got on that. So now we've got our bottom done, and basically our vessel is now ready to begin hollowing. Any questions? I'm going to plane the top off of this right quick while it's in here. I didn't do that before. This one. There, and that brings me to another little, if you want to put a heavy piece on a lathe, a little suggestion, and get it very accurately mounted between centers and get it in a certain place, get yourself a couple of car jacks, these are scissors jacks, from small cars. The smaller the car, the better. The smaller the jack, the better. And have somebody weld or bolt or whatever, a couple of little saddles on them so that they will hold a piece like this. And then you set that piece on those jacks and you can precisely, exactly right down to the fraction of an inch, get it located where you want it. Works really well. Again, there were some questions during the break, and I want to go back over them if I can remember them. One of them was, where do you get these high-speed steel lathe tool bits that you make tools out of? And the answer is, there's a company called MSC and another one called Enco. Those are two industrial supply houses that sell this sort of thing, and they're available on the internet too. You can look the stuff up and you can find these metalworking tool bits. Generally they're, one like this, I'm going to guess is probably going to be about 12 to 15 bucks. And I may be a little bit off on that, but it just seems like that's about where it was. What were some of the other questions? Let's see, I was asked if I spray water on it, which is an excellent question because I forgot a step that I should have taken care of much earlier. This is anchor seal or green wood sealant, and what we generally do when we turn a piece, the first thing we do, just as soon as we've exposed this end grain, especially the end grain, and in this case, we're going to get rid of most of this end grain here, but I'm going to cover that part. But we actually put this green wood sealant on the entire exterior of the piece. And if you look at that, I think the piece that was going around, you could probably feel that on there. And that stays on, of course, until it's turned the second time. And that will keep this piece from cracking and splitting. You especially need to do that on any exposed end grain. And basically what you've done here on this taper and this taper is expose some end grain. So if you don't, especially on places like right here where we're straight across the end grain, by the time you get done with the rest of this process, you will already have cracks developing in that. Sometimes they will begin developing within minutes, depending on the humidity. And then to clean your hands, of course, I have a friend that just goes nuts when I do that. He just, here's a towel. But anyway, we've put the center steady up here so that the wheels are going to be running on this little runway that we created. And you can see that since I moved that, we got a little run out. So I'm going to bring this wheel up until it just touches about half of that, takes up about half of that. And then I'm going to bring this wheel up and just touch the bottom there. And then I'm going to bring the top wheel down, and before I tighten this one, I'm going to press down on it. Press down, tighten, and I'm going to go back and make sure that these are tight. And then I'm going to put a little drag with my fingers. Now, I'm not really cranking on, or I'm not really grasping this hard. I'm just putting a little drag on with my fingers and turn it to feel if there are any spots where this wheel does not turn, in which case I would have to put a little more pressure on. But it's fine. It's turning well. So here we go. Now, yes, if you pick up one of our brochures and you take a look at the bearings, this actually in these 3-inch wheels, it's a 6303 bearing for those of you who know bearings. This is a pretty significant kind of a bearing compared to what most other center steadies have, which are the rollerblade wheels, which are the rollerblade bearings, which are about that big. Now, I used to use that stuff, so I know. Whenever I would be turning with my center steady, I always kept a sleeve or two of extra bearings around because I would hardly ever get through a complete piece without having to replace bearings somewhere. You shell them out pretty fast because the loads and the speeds that we were putting on them were way over the design limits of the bearing. So we're way under the design limits of these bearings here. And on our smaller center steadies, our 10, 12, and 16-inch center steadies have 2-inch wheels instead of 3-inch wheels. They use a US bearing, I can't remember exactly what it is, R16, R8, something like that. It's an R series bearing. Now, as I set this up, we now have this set up, but we need to go ahead and set up our boring bar system, so we'll kind of get that laid out. Before I actually set that up, I'm going to create an end on here that I'm going to use here after a bit. I'm going to put a cone, an inverted cone in the end of this piece, and we're going to use that to locate our the Forstner bit that we're going to use at the next step. So we're just going to kind of like I'm going to use an inch and a half Forstner bit on this to get the metal out of it. We wouldn't have to do that. The system we're going to use with the Monroe Hollower 2 actually will cut all the way to the center of the vessel if you have it set up correctly. But since the wood is moving so slowly in the center, that's kind of a time-consuming deal, and this just speeds things up a lot. I want to double check and make sure I got that big enough before I go on to the next step here. Yes, I do. Boring bar, somewhere around here. This is an 1.125" boring bar, and the center steady is set up for a 1-inch. So, it'll work better on this end. So you need to adjust your trap. I call this a trap boring bar system. Other people have different names for it, but if you call it a trapped system, you have a name for this device right here, which is a trap. Capture is not a noun, so you know, if you say it's a captured system, it doesn't work quite as well, in my opinion. I mean, the semantics don't work quite as well. And I'm going to back this up a little bit here. Okay. Now, in order to adjust, first of all, I need to have I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to have this boring bar be exactly parallel to the ways of the lathe. If they're not, the cutter that we're going to use, which is the Monroe Hollower 2, which is this cutter here. Are you getting close-ups with that, or are we?
I've got a close-up on it now.
Okay. So the Monroe Hollower 2 is actually, this particular one uses a carbide cutter in here, and this little device on the top here is a guard. I call it a guarded ring tool. And this guard can be moved back and forth to adjust the opening of the cutter here. Now, why we use a cutter is very important when you talk about high efficiency deep hollowing. Most boring systems use a scraper, but the most boring system of all uses this. And the reason, or the reasoning behind that is kind of like this. If you had this vessel here and you wanted to take a 1/16 of an inch off of the end of that, and in order to do that, somebody gave you a knife blade like this, would you cut that off like this, or would you try to take it off pushing the knife sideways? Obviously, it would move much more easily going this way than it would this way. This is cutting, this is scraping. If you use a scraper to do hollowing, everything that comes out of this vessel is going to be dust. The system we're going to use here is going to put out chips just like a gouge would, curls. And it should also be evident that to turn wood into dust takes a lot more energy than to turn it into chips, okay? So that's why, one of the reasons high efficient, that's one of the reasons why our boring bars have a much greater capacity than the equivalent sizes on most other systems. Most other systems take the outrigger and keep it out here 6 or 8 inches away from the main body of the bar. We took the outrigger and we welded it right to the bar. That does a couple of things for us. First of all, it adds the stiffness of this additional bar into this one. And it also adds the mass of that into this. And to fight vibration, it takes mass. The more mass you have, the harder it is to move it back and forth. We also use solid bars for the same reason, more mass. We could use tubes and get pretty close to the same amount of stiffness. However, and there are people that argue this, however, bear in mind that you're supporting, if you use a tube, you're supporting it on one point right here, and if the tube begins to deform just a little bit, it's going to do that. And with a solid bar, that deformation can't take place. You can't push on this hard enough to make it come closer to this side. I mean, within reason. Okay. Now, the other thing is about putting the outrigger there is that in the trap, I have a much greater range of motion now than I would have if I had the outrigger out here. That would restrict me quite a bit. I want to say a little bit about rollers. By the way, you saw this. There's one finger here, and let me put before I knock that off of there. I can take this one finger and I can move this bar anywhere I want with one finger. Why put a roller in there? Because if you have a roller in there and you want to do this and go straight in that way, that roller is going to be pulling that end of the bar over as it goes. And you're going to be fighting that all the time anyway. You're going to have to slide it on the roller. So we don't believe in using a roller. I could actually leave that in there now, I think. Okay, back to we want to get this parallel. So what I'm going to do is I got a level here, and I'm going to put the level on the body of the lathe, and I'm going to read the level. And I see that the bubble is just past the line on this side, and then I'm going to get the bar. Wow, that's very close. I don't think I'm going to mess with that. The other thing that I didn't do yet was adjust the trap for this size bar. And what you do is you bring it over to one end of the trap. By the way, I think we have a video on our website that shows this. I've got a number of videos, and I think I've only got one of them posted so far because there's just so much time in a day. And okay, Now, it's trapped right there, and I'm going to just back it off just a little bit so it moves. I'm going to go over the other side, and I'm going to basically do the same thing. I'm going to bring this down until it's trapped like that. I'm going to back it off until it just moves. I'm going to come back over here and find that this is going to have to come up just a hair. And basically, we're good now. The bar is nice and tight in there. I could come... Yes, thank you. Paraffin wax. That's what makes this thing slide so easily. You just put it on that surface there, this surface here. The paraffin wax will not hurt your turning, and you get it on all these surfaces that are going to move around. And again, then you'll have this situation here where it moves very easily. Okay, so we want to take the middle out of this. Now, we had one of the guys in our chapter did a demonstration one night here 2-3 years ago, and he came up with he was boring some end grain with a Colt Maxi Cut Forstner bit. I don't know how many of you have run into these. These things are a whole different Forstner bit than any I've ever seen before. They drive so easily. I mean, he was sitting there talking and just cranking the center steady, or the tailstock in as fast as he could go with no effort whatsoever. So I thought, aha, we can use that. So we made an adapter, and we sell this adapter, that drives a Colt bit by the little flats on it, because they use a special proprietary drive system called Rotostop. And you got to have the right driver for it, and it's kind of highly technical stuff. It frankly is beyond the capability of my limited shop. So we build this adapter, and we now can put, we could, if we had these set screws out of the way maybe, we can now put this Colt Maxi Cut bit, can't we? You know what? That didn't come out of there because it will probably work better with this one. Like I said, didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so.
You know what they say, it works better than none.
Darn right. They also say you should never make excuses. You know, when I worked in industry, there were some people, I'm sure you've run onto those, there were some people around that said, I don't want to ever hear any excuses. How about a reason? Yeah. Stick to your measuring. So we already made that little inverted cone in there. That's going to line that up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this boring bar over against this side of the trap, and I'm going to move the banjo over. By the way, that reminds me of something else. There's a little note on the end of these boring bars that says warning, safety pin required, and here it is. And Joe Merhage, my partner, my business partner, he likes to set up the system, and you know, even if he went all the way to the chuck, he still wouldn't pull that in through the trap, so he doesn't put the safety pin in. And I get highly upset with him. The safety pin goes in every single time, regardless. If you're working down here and you're paying attention to what's going on down here, and you accidentally pull that bar through that trap, the force down here is this way and down. If I take that end of that bar down and around, where's this end going to go? Right here. So the safety pin is absolutely essential. One of the other questions I had during the break was, what are these little pins for right here beside these wheels? And what those are for is to keep your fingers from going into that run-in point. The first center steady I ever had was made in England. I bought it at Craft Supplies a long, long time ago, and it didn't have those. And I looked at that, and one of the jobs I had in industry was as a safety guy. And I mean, immediately I thought, oh wow, especially when you do the big pieces, If you got maybe 100 pounds or 200 pounds or 300 pounds left here, and you accidentally go there, your hand is gone or your fingers are gone. It's not going to slow down. It's not going to stop. It's not going to give. So the pins are there for that reason. So, okay, one more time. We're going to go in here like this. We're going to have this loose clothing. Yeah, long sleeve shirts you should never wear while you're turning, right? Okay, so I'm pretty close to center, on center here, and yeah, that's looking good. Now what I'm going to do is start this kind of slowly and make sure that we've got it set up right, and that's still too fast. Okay, so then we simply push this bar in, and if I could get a little bit of help on this, I've been trying to get this bit sharpened. Somebody push on the end of that a little bit. Usually you can push this in fairly easily, but I still haven't got all the little smiles off the end of that. So thank you. Yes. Uh-huh.
Too much.
Just a little bit. Okay. All right, now you can't go too far, and you got to pull it back out and clear the chips. And the reason for that is we're creating quite a bit of heat in there, and that's wet wood. And if you just keep going in, the wood is going to swell in there, and it's going to lock up. And you got two choices: buy a new bit or cut the piece apart. You take it back out. Switch here. Okay. I probably should have checked. Yeah. We're gonna take a second here and do this, right? Because we may do some more. Now I know this lathe is still turned on, so I'm keeping my fingers way the heck out of the way of this belt. If the lathe starts up, they're clear. Okay, we should have the power we need now. A little more than that. Okay. Now we can push on it. What's that?
This is moving.
Okay. Actually, there's no point in going much further. You've seen that. You know how it works. No point in going all the way. But what I didn't say, thank you very much. That's as far as we're going to go. What I didn't mention is that if I were going to go all the way down here, I would bring the bar up alongside here to the point where it's going to go and take a piece of tape and put it on here, so when the tape got there I knew I was to the right depth. However, since we're short on time and there's no point in you sitting there watching us drill all the way to the bottom of this, we're going to go to the next tool. We're just going to take this one out of there. Something that you should always do that I almost didn't do: anytime you use a hex wrench on one of these socket head screws, hex socket head screws or set screws, be sure to get the dust out first. Because if you don't, this doesn't go all the way down into it, and you end up rounding the end of this off and rounding the top part of this off, and pretty soon you find that you're going to have a double the time getting those out of there, and you're going to have to replace them, and you have to grind the end off of this. So make sure it seats all the way to the bottom each time, and you won't have that problem. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take that out of there, and we're going to replace it with the Monroe Hollower 2. Now, I guess we already talked about that, so I'm just going to get it put in there and tighten it. Sorry. A hunter? This actually, no, this is not a hunter. We have replaced the Rolling Monroes that I had before had high-speed steel cutters in them, and Mike Hunter gave me the right size cutter, carbide for that, and my business partner and I used that first one for 9 months, and we do a lot of turning. and it was 9 months before it got dull. So, and then if you have the right kind of sharpening equipment and you really, really can be careful about it, you can put a new edge on that carbide too. You need a diamond, and you need to be very, very light, well, very, very light touch, because you cut just a little bit too much off of that and you've gotten way too much of that edge is gone. It is possible to resharpen it. High-speed steel is easier to resharpen, but if you do a lot of hickory like we do, hickory takes the edge off of high-speed steel in a hurry. Yeah, the thing I started out to say was the wood has to go down through this cutter across the top of that cutter and squirt back out, up the top. While this is an extremely efficient way to do that, if you get your speed up too high, it simply is not possible for the wood to make that corner and come back quickly enough, and you'll lose the efficiency. So you want to toy with the speed a little bit, keep turning it up until you begin to not do quite as well, and then back off a little bit and you're at the maximum point of efficiency. You can open this up quite a ways when you're on green wood like this, and you can get some really big chips, big heavy chips out of this thing. However, when you're in dry wood, you really need to shut it down quite a bit, because dry wood creates a lot more force, and you'll get a much nicer cut if you turn it down. Oh, one other thing, you can open this up far enough that it will self-feed, and that's an experience that you don't want, because it's the clue is when you suddenly see chips up here, and now I know what it is. You know, when I see it, I recognize it immediately. The first couple of times that happened, where'd those come from? You know, until it falls apart. You know? So we put this in here like this. Now, you can go straight in like that, or you can keep making cuts across. This cutter will actually cut both directions, coming and going, so that's advantageous. The angle at which you put it here can be changed. This is a little bit sharp. If I wanted to really go in through this fast, I'd probably take this about 10 more degrees toward the front, and then I could go back and forth. The problem when you're going in, the problem with going in and going out to the edge each time is that your brain is not very good at trying to calculate exactly how far out you're coming each time. If you mount the laser up here, you can see where you are. But if you don't have a laser, and one of the guys who worked with me quite a while just loved to do it that way, and I keep arguing with him, and he'd go through a lot of vessels because he'd get in there a ways and then whoops, a little bit too far. So if you go in just like that second cut I made where you're going along the inside the long way, your brain can calculate much more accurately how close you are to the outside edge as you're doing that. So I'm getting in where you can't see it, but and I can't use that. I'm going to change the angle of that a little bit. The laser will mount on the bar here, and I'm going to straighten that a little bit. Oh. Our center steadies, if you look at this offset 7 degrees, that creates clearance here for your laser. And the other thing, you'll see that when we mount our laser, the base of the laser is offset from the bar for the same reason. A lot of people that use these tools, what I was going to say earlier was, a lot of the people that use these tools say they plug up. And you know, if I look at this right now, it's full of wood. You could say that it's plugged, but all I have to do to clear it is just bump it into the wood like that, and it clears, and away we go. So now that I straighten that out a little bit, so I'm going to go in just a little bit further here. See, now that was plugged when I started. I never even thought about it. I just bumped it a little bit, and away we went. Okay, again, there's no, you've seen that, there's no point in belaboring that anymore. Here's another nice chip out of that. So we're going to set up the laser. And again, this is, I get the junk, by the way. This is an old model. It's just like you would get off a gouge. You are soon going to spend far more time clearing the chips out than you are actually turning. Once they aren't falling out of the end like that, once you get down in there, you create chips so quickly that I blast them out with air, or we will be glad to make you one of these tools for $50, and you can just take that in there and scrape them out. Back to that for a second. It's a piece of conduit flattened and bent. So if you want to make yourself one of those. Now, what I want to do here is establish my final thickness before I set the laser. I'll kind of show you what. By the way, this little device up here, generally on most of my vessels, once I have this set, these two positions right here will allow me to do the whole thing. I don't generally need any more than that. Now see there, it's this. Okay, that's the thickness that I want. So I'm going to bring this up about right there. I think that's a good height. And turn that on. And I know what my thickness is right here, so I'm just going to take the laser up and put it to the outside of the vessel, if I can find it, like this. Where are you? There it is. Okay, so there's everything I need to know. The laser dot, for those of you who haven't not seen this, and I don't think, can you bring the camera around on this side right here? And I think we can show it. If you come around, can it come, get enough? Okay, right in here. So you can see the laser dot is up on the piece, and as you come over to the thickness you want, it turns into a line down the side of the vessel, and that's what you're looking for. That's the thickness that you want. Now, so if I turn this on, and I come in here like this, as I work my way down, by the way, did you see that dot disappear for a second? That's not good. That means it's a little thin right there. But right there is what I want. So I can just work my way on down the vessel at about that speed. You know, I would have the inside turned out. Thank you very much. And that's all there is to using the laser and getting your thickness done the way you want it. And let's see, we're doing pretty well for time. So about time for another break for a little bit, and what we're going to do is switch over to the other vessel and the dry vessel. So you can see now, let me finish up by saying we would hollow this all the way to the bottom, and then we would turn this little runway off of here and put some anchor seal on that, and then we would hang this thing upside down to dry. And if it were in the wintertime, the humidity in the studio gets down to around 30%. Things dry really quickly. So we would probably put wax paper over the end of this, a rubber band to hold it in place, and poke 2 or 3 little holes in it to retard the drying on the inside of the vessel. Otherwise, the inside will dry much faster than the outside, and it will crack. And that's the whole idea with drying these things, is to dry inside and out at the same, all the way through the wood at the same rate. Generally, in the summertime, you don't need to put anything on there. You know, I have a devil of a time keeping the humidity down to 60. I can't even really, this summer, didn't get it down to 60% in there with a dehumidifier running practically all the time. So that makes a big difference, and nothing is needed on the end. They're hung upside down, because if they were right side up, or even on their side, the moist air is heavier than dry air. Therefore, the moist air would lay in there and you would get stuff start to grow in there that you don't want to have to deal with. So hanging it upside down lets all the moisture fall out, if you will, and helps it to dry equally all the way through.
How green was that wood when you cut it?
Cut it today, turn it today. I have, if we get a chance to use these lathes, I have a couple of systems that will work on those lathes over there. And if we get a chance, those pieces that I brought along for that are quite a bit drier, and you can see the difference. They're not dry, but they're a lot drier than this.
When you hang it, how long do you leave it there?
Smart ass answer, until it's dry. But how do you know it's dry? Okay, I use a pinless moisture meter. And I just put the pinless moisture meter up against it, and if it reads around 10% or below, I know it's dry. And I don't worry about conversion tables or anything like that. We're not talking about rocket science here. We just need to know that the vessel's pretty dry. If it reads much over 10%, it's still got a ways to go. If you don't have a moisture meter, you can weigh the piece. And you have to have a fairly accurate scale and weigh it and write down the weight. And when that weight stops falling, if you were to chart it, it's going to go kind of like this, and then it's going to kind of level off. And when it begins to level off, you know you're down there to the dry point. Time-wise, it depends on how thick the piece is, the species of wood, how wet it was to begin with, what the humidity is, wherever you got it hung up, and all kinds of other factors. Maybe what you had for breakfast the other day, I don't know. It'll be anywhere from 2 weeks at the very quickest to 6 months. The thicker you leave the piece, I mean, that can add a lot in a hurry.
So you got a pinless in
Pinless moisture meter. Yeah, Wagner L609, I think it is, or something like that. One step that I didn't mention is we usually put them in a freezer, always, actually not usually, always put them in a freezer for a day or two before we hang them up to dry. Now, what that does is there's two types of moisture in here. There's free moisture that comes out very easily, very quickly. And that's the kind of moisture that if you had a dry piece of wood and you put it out in the rain and it absorbed a little rain and then you brought it back inside, it'd dry pretty quickly and you'd be back to where you were when you started. However, there is water entrapped within cells in this wood. Now, the reason a tree out there doesn't freeze in the wintertime, no matter how cold it gets, is because it has a natural antifreeze built into it. But once you cut the tree, that system is gone. So now you can put it into a freezer for a couple of days, make sure it's frozen all the way through, and what that does is crystallize the water that's inside the cells, which breaks the cell walls, and that water then becomes free water and comes out very easily. So just to give you an example, I made 2 vessels just as precisely the same as I could possibly do, which is very difficult, by the way. And I froze one and did not freeze the other. The one that was frozen, and hung them up to dry, the one that was frozen reached equilibrium moisture content in about 2 weeks, and the other one, after a month and a half, was still not down there. So it's a dramatic difference just to freeze it for a day or two. You got to make sure it's in there long enough to freeze all the way through. If you're turning wood that already has been cut and is sitting outside in the wintertime, and you're sure it's frozen through, you can skip that step because it's been done for you in advance. Okay, let's take a break again, and we're going to change the setup one more time. Okay, now we have it dry. We've finished our vessel, and we've hung it up, and we now know that it's dry and it's ready for the second turning. Now, no matter what, no matter how carefully you select your wood, things are going to warp a little bit out around, and they aren't going to be straight like they were. So we can't use this foot that we used before. We need to recut it. And the way we recut it is to mount, first of all, a piece of scrap wood we throw in here. So we put that in there, and that's going to be now our driver that is going to drive the cone end of this, because we need to retrue up that foot. In order to do that, we've got to have, and by the way, I didn't talk about these shaft collars on here and on here. Once you set this system up for your lathe, and you adjust those shaft collars. When I'm ready to go back and do this again, I drop that in and it's done. Here, same way, if I take this out for any reason, put it back in and we're ready to go. So the shaft collars do that. The other thing that they do is they absorb all the down forces, so you don't have to try to crank this little adjustable handle to the point here where it can't be hammered down. So anyway, I think we're about back to business here. I need my, by the way, people said they appreciated little aside comments. Here's one. In my studio, you will never ever see, I hope, a quill like this that doesn't have a center in it. And the reason for that is if they sit around with this out of there, junk gets in there. And these Morse tapers do not react well to having junk in there. They become inaccurate, they don't stay, they turn on you, and so on and so forth. So I just, as a matter of course, always keep one in. If I pull one out for some reason, I throw a different one in. Just another one of those little pieces of hard-learned advice. The question here is, do we ever use UHMW plastic for this? No, we're going to use this as a drive piece, and the plastic is too slippery naturally to be a good driver. So we make these, and this by the way is not UHMW, it's HDPE, slightly different plastic. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Actually, there's one more thing I need to do here before I come to that part. And I want to talk a little bit about this, so we'll take it out again. You may or may not have noticed that this tailstock live center has no pin in it. Now these pins are on a taper, another little Morse taper in here, and they can be knocked out. That's one of the things that this little knockout rod that comes with it, if you put that, I've got this one closed off, but you can put that in there, tap it a couple of times, and that point will come out. I would suggest that unless you are turning spindles that are part square and part round, that you never use that point. Because that point, once you see what I'm going to do with this here after a bit, if that point were in there, I would not be able to do this. The point will cause the thing to always go back where you don't want it to. For example, this piece has the hole in it here where we hung it up. We just put a little screw in there and hang them up in the trusses. Yeah. So now what I want to do here is I'm just going to bring this up arbitrarily and say, okay, that's roughly about where I want to be. I'm going to take my tool rest here, put it up so the tool rest is roughly right on center. I'm going to just touch the back side of this thing, and I'm going to turn it one revolution. Oh Lord, this is not good. It's very accurate. It's so accurate it doesn't need an adjustment. I mean, we hit this right on. That should never happen that way. It's hard to do a demonstration. Well, yeah, if the point were in there, it would have gone where that was, may or may not be right. But the point is, let me just turn it off center so I can demonstrate. What usually happens is, okay, now I have a gap of 1/8 of an inch right there. So I take this and I move this back about half of that and rotate it again, and there's my widest opening point. And I'm going to move that over again. Whoops, just a little bit too much. Okay, there we are. Now, that's normally what you would always have to do. But notice, now, see the run out on the foot? So when it dried, it moved. Okay, we need to recut that to go back in the chuck, so we can't put that back in the chuck this way because we're going to have all kinds of weird things going on. So we bring this over here, and one of the things I'm a little concerned about is that this is fairly small. I think the chuck will go down that small, but we're soon going to find out. And we'll true this up real quick like. And I'm going to take a little more off the back here if I can. That should be enough. And we're going to find the right tool here, maybe. Here it is. And we're going to recut our dovetail. Okay, so we have an accurate dovetail place to grip now that is as true as possible with this bottom part of this vessel. So we're going to just lock him in there. We're still not touching the bottom there. Now, we need support on the other end. This is where this system of cone centers comes in handy. This is a small one, and they're 3/4 10. And I use the plastic because when I do vessels like those over there, they're completely finished on the lathe before we ever cut that tang off on the foot. So it's done, finished. The only things left to do is sign the bottom, put a little finish on the bottom. So when I bring this up to support that while I'm cutting that little tang off the bottom there, I don't want to destroy the finish that's already in there. So that's why we use the plastic. Now the plastic, I can go up and I can support this, whether it's raw wood or a finished piece like that, it'll work just as well. I didn't talk about my philosophy about gouges, for example. I use a Wolverine system, and I know there are people like Mike Mahoney and some other folks, you know, they buy their gouges by the dozen or the gross or whatever, and they go through them real fast because they turn a little turning, hand grind, turn, hand grind, turn, hand grind. I use a Wolverine system, and I mark this. I know that this one, the setting on the Wolverine system is halfway between the side grind setting and the fingernail grind setting. And I have on the flat plate on my Wolverine system, I have 3 lines scribed on there. So I would put this in the Wolverine system, set it to the halfway point, bring it up to the middle line, tighten it down, and it's ready to go. I simply put it up against the grinding wheel, make sure I don't have any light showing top, bottom, turn it on, and go shh, shh, and I have a brand new grind on this, and I've only taken off a few thousandths of an inch. Now, obviously, there's not a whole really long period of time that you can do that before you have to grind again. But instead of grinding again, I take a diamond file and I just lightly go over that, and I have a brand new edge. I can do that 3 or 4 times before I have to go back to the grinder. So while a lot of people are going to be going to the grinder every 10 or 15 minutes, I go every 2 or 3 days or so, you know, and it works just fine for me. So we're going to start, first of all, I like to start at the top and work my way down. So we're going to, again, you can see how much run out we've got up here. Although, once again, the cone centers on the most important part of the vessel here. We're as center as we can be here, and we're as center as we can be right in here. So I think I'll use a smaller gouge to start with. And we'll just kind of like true this up here. Now, a lot of times when I'm turning, and what I'm trying to do right here is create a part of this vessel that's absolutely parallel to the axis of the lathe. So when I'm doing that, rather than looking down here where the gouge is, I'm actually looking up over the top here and looking at the line I've got between here and the floor. It would be nice if the floor were a little bit darker, I could see that a little bit better, but I can see it fine. And I can also hear and feel that I'm not round yet. Should be. Yeah, there's just a little bit there. So I get that as straight as I can. And the next thing I want to do is I want to define the thickness of this vessel, the final thickness of this vessel. If somebody could bring me one of those over there, one of the smaller ones that's finished. When you pick up a vessel, you probably hear this. By the way, I love, our chapter does, thank you very much, our chapter does critiques. And I really, I'm adamantly in favor of critiques, because we all come here and we learn what or how to do things, but nobody teaches us what to do. So the critique does that. If you pick up the vessels over there and you say, and I would look at this one and I would say, okay, I'm going to critique this, and let's see, I think this line is pretty good. It flows pretty well. It may be just a tiny bit. If I would hold this up here so that you guys can see it against the black, there may be just a little bit of a kind of a flat right in here. You see that? And then when you get up here to the shoulder of this vessel, it's too tapered. There's a subconscious relationship when you look at a vessel like this to a human being. And a human with a really sloped shoulders is a weak form. That's why, military uniforms have epaulettes, because they give you square shoulders and they make you look tougher and stronger. So that applies here too. The psychology applies. This is too sloped. It needs to be flatter, right in there. Let's see, the rest of it I think is pretty good. We got just a little bit of a knuckle at the bottom of this curve down here. This curve comes down and goes just kind of shooting off down here, right down that way, instead of coming all the way down and going around the bottom. So those are the kind of things we talk about in critique. Now, did anybody learn anything from that, my critique of my own vessel? All right, and that's what critique does for you. The objective is not to come in here and say, Sinner, you did a really lousy job on that piece. That's not it at all. What we try to do is say, you got a nice vessel there. I think you could make it just a little bit better if you kind of watch that curve right in there, and maybe you need to round this a little bit more, and you're done with it. You go on to the next piece. One or two things that you think could improve that. Sometimes you can't see anything that you can improve, just say so. Sometimes you pick up a piece and it is so bad, so thick, so bad, you don't know what to say. Same thing, say, hey, you're coming along really well. You're improving, and I think you can do this a little bit better. One or two things and go on with it. So that's critique. So if you want to think about that and use it, you will see your instant gallery table improve immeasurably. So I go in to do demonstrations in chapters like this. I can look at that table and I'll tell you with at least 95% accuracy whether or not they do critiques, just by looking at what's over there. Excuse me. What I started out to say wasn't that at all. What I started out to say is I want to define the thickness of this vessel right here. And when you look at this edge right here and walk over to this vessel to pick it up off the table, whether or not you think it is too heavy or too light is entirely going to be determined by that edge right there. And this tells you how thick this vessel ought to be, and your brain has already decided if that vessel is that thick, it ought to weigh about this. And when you pick it up, you will know. Is it too heavy or too light? There are exceptions. There are exceptions to almost every rule. There are a lot of times when we want to make like platters or bowls or flat, something in between a platter and a bowl, and we want thick parts in there. It's fine. That's your intention. But you should be able to visually pick that up from clues that are given to you before you touch it. You shouldn't be surprised. So we're going to define the top of this, the thickness of this piece. And let's see, I'm going to go in about, maybe a little more. This is dry wood now, and I can see dust that's raising up here in this light. And talk about that a little bit. In my studio, I have a 0 tolerance for dust. Every one of my workstations has 2 4-inch drops from a system that Oneida said would never, ever work. When I called them up and said, I need this many feet of 30-inch pipe, they say, it's impossible on that dust collector. And I said, no, it's not. Yes, it is. That won't work. The dynamic or static pressure or some darn thing, I don't know which one. Some pressure isn't going to be big enough or it's going to be too big or anyway. And it's just going to fill up with wood chips. Well, those folks are used to designing systems for wood shops that are picking up the stuff that comes off planers, comes off shapers, comes off table saws, all that sort of thing, which is not the dust that's floating around in the air here. All I care about is the dust that's floating around in the air. So One of those drops is probably going to be terminated in one of those plastic containers you get at like Walmart and Kmart and so on, that they're just little, maybe yay square and about that deep things like you could shove under the bed. So you take one of those and you cut the ends in circles so they kind of fit in here, and you cut a hole for your 4-inch drop there. You put that here, and the other hose will be wherever I consider there to be a weak spot. The end of a dust collecting hose doesn't collect the dust from over there. It collects the dust from a ball shape that has a center in the end of that hose. So I don't need to collect that air from back there. When I put this piece of plastic up here, I cause all of the air to come from here. None of it can come from behind. This is where the dust is, and it all goes in there. At the end of the day, if I do that with my glasses and hold them up to the light and I see dust particles on my glasses, something was wrong. If I see, as in this light's pretty bright, if I see that dust floating around the air, something's wrong. The second it's created here, it should go right in there. And that's the way we work. Everything else falls on the floor, but that fine dust, the stuff that kills us, the stuff that gives us problems, is trapped and picked up. Now, when I learned woodworking, actually was in college, and the only thing we worried about was that the finishing room had to be dust-free. That had dust filters and everything. But in the lab where we were all working, I mean, sometimes it was so bad that, it was like looking through a cloud from one end of the room to the other. And we're all inhaling that stuff. And it's not good for us at all. So, enough said about that. So I want this to be a little thinner than that. Not like that, I think. Now, line and form. This is where I'm going to really define that. When I talk about lines shooting off into space, like we were talking about the line here that comes down right there and then kind of shoots off that way instead of coming all the way around, there's a similar thing right up here at the top. I want this line right at the top to go straight out that way. I don't want it to come up here and kind of get wishy-washy out here somewhere. I want it to go that way. And right now is where I define that. I'm making the final cut on that, the final shape. Yeah. So then I'm going to come back over here, and I think better gouge. By the way, when you have a piece that's out around like this one is, you need to tame that. And a lot of times I see people try to push their gouge in there to tame that, and what they're doing is they're just carrying that oval shape further and further in. What you need to do to arrest that is go to a part of the gouge that has less edge presented to the wood. The smaller edge you have here, the less pushback you're going to get from the wood, and more pressure on the tool rest and less on the wood. And that's the way you'll get rid of that. So I'm using just this little tiny part of right near the point of the gouge right here. And another thing, I don't know if you can pick this up, but what I'm looking for, I have no point in passing this around, but what, huh? Okay, what I'm looking for are these little curly chips. They're like the chips. You see the little spirals? That's the kind of chips that you would get off of a drill when you started into a piece of steel. I'm looking for that kind of thing to come out of here because I know if I'm getting those nice little spiral chips that I'm getting a really good cut on here. And I like to liken that to having the cutting edge at a 45-degree angle to the axis of the lathe. If you get that cutting edge at about that 45-degree and then you twist the gouge until you just feel that cut getting sweet, you can feel it and you can hear it in most cases. And that's what you're looking for here. So now that I've kind of gotten rid of that oval shape, I can change and come down here to the middle of the long part of the gouge and kind of do a shear scraping cut. And again, I apply that particular edge that I want to use to the wood, and then it twists the gouge until it picks up the kind of cut that I want here. And again, I'm going to be getting those nice little twists. And as I come across here, now, if we stop this and take a close look to it, you'll see that this is barely going to need any sanding. It is going to need sanding, but it's nice and smooth and shiny because of the way we did that cut. Now that I get to this point, I can't really do that. Well, I can do a little bit more. I can just get rid of some of this wood here. But what I want to do next is I want to ride the bevel here. And I'm going to pick this cut up, again with just the point of the gouge, and I'm going to come in this way, and I'm going to swing. I'm going to do much more swinging of the end of the handle of the gouge than I am pushing forward. And I'm going to try to follow this line around. Now remember, we said about the flat on the shoulder. So as I get right about here, I'm going to think to myself, I'm going straight in right there. And then I'm going to take the curve on around like this and try to get rid of some of this stuff. Now, that's kind of bad right in there, pretty far out around. And I'm just going to get rid of the out around part. And then I'm going to change weapons. And because this one doesn't have any tape on it, I'll use it. There are also some wood turners that will tell you if you use a scraper, you don't know what you're doing, you're not a good wood turner. That's BS. The scraper is a tool, and if it's the tool that's best for the job at hand and best for the way you work, it's a very legitimate tool. And it will do this curve that I want to get just right in here much, much, much easier than I could do it with a gouge. Now I could work and work and work and work and maybe get it with a gouge, but it is so easy to go wrong with a gouge. Right in here, I can take this, come in, and remember that flat part right there. Come on around now. I'm not trying to take that out around this out with a gouge. You know, I'm just finessing this. Come back in on the other side a little bit right here. That flat. On down around there. Now I want a certain shape right in here. And again, I'm not looking at the scraper. This is scraper. I'm not looking at the scraper at all. I'm looking across the top and looking at the line. So as I come across like this, and I know that shape kind of reminds me of a fish hook. But if you look at my pieces over there, you'll see that every one of them has that particular shape right in there. Another signature element of my work. And okay, now I've got it, all right? I've got that just exactly the way I want it from right there, which defines the top of the bezel, to right here. That's the toughest part. Now we just have to run this curve down. And again, we got to get rid of that out around business, so we're using the point of the gouge with a lot of pressure on the tool rest. I'm just trying to get rid of wood right now. I'm not trying to do a shape. I don't want to go too deep. Okay, use a lot more speed. By the way, while I'm doing this, is this piece going to get more in balance or more out of balance? Anybody? More out of balance. Because I'm taking off, you know, it was, to start with, the same thickness all the way around. On a piece this size and a lathe this size, doesn't really matter. Because, you know, this lathe can't tell that this thing's out of balance. There's way too great a differential. But if I had a lighter lathe, it might get to the point where I might want to have to turn my speed down, or not turn it up as high as I'd like to have it. Now that's about full speed for this baby on Remember, this is where you make or break it. When Joe and I work together, what we do at this point, whoever's running the gouge, the other person's on that side of the lathe. And we are having a constant conversation about this line. You know, right now, I'm sure Joe would tell me that there's a flat right in here, almost a hollow. Can you see it? If I get, you know, you get it black. So that's something we got to get rid of. That's not a good form. Two things I can do about that. Since it is pretty close to the top here, I can still go back over here and take a little of this down. And then, instead of going back in there like I was, I can use the side of my gouge really quickly to blend that, just like that. Just use it as a scraper, and I don't have to go change tools or anything. Now I can come back over here and see if I can get that flat out of there. Now, I'm beginning to run into a problem here, which again, I see I got quite a bit of run out right in here, and I better, before I do this next cut, I better try to get rid of some of that. You probably haven't been noticing this, but I almost always have the handle of the gouge against my body here. That's one thing that you can get used to doing. When you're doing these lines like this, the steadier you can do it, the more you can have it with your body instead of your hands. Just like if those of you who shoot, you know that, you know, if you can steady everything to your body, or photographers, if you can steady your arms, bring your shoulders in like this, you can hold the camera steadier. You can hold the gouge steadier as you move. The other thing is, especially when I'm doing larger pieces, is before I start this cut, I like to step over here to where I'm going to end and then come back. Because if I'm running this line and I get about to here and I feel I have to move, I have to start over, because I'm going to get a little warble in there. Warble. That's a new word for that. Oh well. I don't want to take up too much time here. I'm going to go back and go to this rub the bevel cut here, and this is a little bit dangerous, but I think on this piece, I think we can get by with it. So that's not bad. I would probably take, I'm going to kind of skip over this quickly, but I'm going to just take this gouge and use the side of it again as a scraper, and those little, slight little hollows and high spots that were in there will really easily be carried off like this. Now, when we're doing that, we're actually scraping this piece, and we're going to kind of mess up the surface a little bit, so it's not going to be as pretty as it was. But there's a thing that will take care of that. Really, if we want to do it this way, we could go back and really work at it with a gouge and get it right, but that takes a little more time. So what we can do with this piece is there's a material called sandpaper that will do a really super job at that. We're not going to do that here today. And I got another little thing I want to talk about. There are also people in the wood turning community that'll say, or in the woodworking community, they'll say, if you ever have to use sandpaper any more coarse than 180 grit, there's something wrong with you. Well, I want to tell you that when you do large vessels and you're doing these lines, there is no way that I know of, I'm simply not good enough, that I'm not going to have some swales and some slight imperfections. And how can you tell? You take your hand and you put on here like this. More about that in a second. But how do we get rid of those on that big vessel? We use 60 grit sandpaper with a very heavy backing. And we don't ever press the sandpaper in with our fingers. We hold it like it were a belt or something, and not straight across, but at an angle, and we go like this. And as we go back and forth with that, we'll immediately begin to see the difference between the high spots and the low spots. and you will very quickly see when you've got them all off. Now you got 60 grit scratches against the grain around your piece. You just go to the next grit and sand those out, and the next grit and sand those out, and the next grit and sand those out. If you use nice, new, fresh sandpaper, it's only going to take a matter of seconds, maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds for each grit, and you'll be done. And all those will be gone. Now, if you try to use the sandpaper until it's like almost worn through, it's going to take you a very long time to get that all done. It took me a long time to learn that. And I also use an inertial sander, 3-inch disc. I tried those a long time ago once, and they didn't work worth a darn, so I gave up on them. And then we had Bruce Hoover of the Sanding Glove, who's one of our actually our only supplier, and he did a demonstration for our chapter one time, and I saw what I had been doing wrong with an inertial sander, and I found the value of it. And I can actually sand a vessel the size of that black one, either one of those black ones over there. I'll sand that varnish off of there with one 3M 260L, that's the model of the sanding grit, 600 grit. I'll sand all of the gloss off of the coat of varnish so I can put the next one on in about 10, maybe 15 seconds, and it'll be done. Now, if I took a sanding pad and did this, I'd be there forever. But the other one is just, and basically that's it.
How wide a
So,
band do you use for the 60?
it's a 3-inch disc.
Oh, okay.
It's on an inertial sander now. The 60 grit was, I think they're 6-inch wide. They're like sanding belts that I got a hold of a long time ago, long ones, and I just cut them up. Okay.
Are you sanding at high speed, Steve, when you're...
Yeah. Back to the varnish for a second. If you're going to use that varnish, you need to put one coat on top of another. You have to sand between coats. Don't follow the directions on the can that say sand it at 220 grit. Don't do that, because you will see those 220 grit scratches all over that vessel as if they were irrigation canals. So you want to use 600 grit, and the important thing is to get all of the gloss off. Check it several different ways in the light, catch the reflections, and anywhere you have any gloss left on it, the next coat of varnish will not stick. But I learned that's one of the things. Another one of the neat things that I got to do because of this was I got to go to the Smithsonian Institution and visit the Lunder Conservation Lab, where they take care of all the articles that that part of the Smithsonian has. And I learned a lot of things. And two of the major things that I learned were that, number one, dyes are temporary. That's important. And, I had always thought that metal acid dyes were permanent, and some other dyes weren't. And dyes are beautiful on wood. They give the most glorious, deep colors, they're just beautiful. But the guys at the Conservation Lab say dyes are chemical processes, and they are temporary. They will disappear over a period of time. Some will last longer than others, but eventually the color is going to be gone. The only permanent colors are the ones that are pigmented. They're the only ones. So that's important to me. The other thing that I learned there that was really important is that CA glue is temporary. There is no CA glue anywhere that will last. It's all going to turn to a white powder. That may be months, years, maybe decades, but it's all going to turn to a white powder. So think about that, because I used it a lot in the past. And there's a lot of people that have put pieces together with CA glue, and they expect that they're going to be there for their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids and so on and so forth. They're not going to be, I'm sorry to say. If you use dyes or you use CA glue, those are two things that are off of my tool list, unless it's for temporary use. Like CA glue is a lot of times used temporary. And we have that same little problem on the bottom here again as we had on the other piece, and basically we'll take care of it in the same way. We're going to use that special gouge, come around the corner, and in this case here, I'm hardly putting any forward pressure on this gouge. When I teach this, students always have a problem with it. What you're doing, what you need to think about here, rather than pushing that gouge around the corner, is just moving the handle. The gouge will go around the corner when you move the handle. So I swing this out like this, like that. Okay. So basically we've defined that, and I see I got a little bit of a lump there, and I'm just going to take that off like that, and we got that done. So the exterior of this is basically finished now. I could do a little work on the bottom here, make it a little thinner, but I think I'm just going to leave it. And now that I go back and look at my piece, I see that right in there, I didn't get all the way through to new wood. Well, there's the old stuff right there. So now I'm not going to do that right now, but I'm basically going to have to go back. We'll set up the center steady here, and I'll show you how you start this next one. After we get this one started, basically finishing the rest of the inside of this is going to be with the laser and the Monroe just exactly the way we did the other one, except that we're going to turn that Monroe hollower down. We're going to take that guard on it and take it way down so there's very little exposure on the end of it, because this wood is really quite hard and will react quite a bit differently. I'm glad you brought that up, because I started to say once I'd get back to this. And when I do this, I can see I got work to do on this. Here in a minute, I'll try to remind me to pass this thing around so everybody can do this. It's very important. This will not tell you a doggone thing, okay? Well, you do this all day long and it feels just great. But if you put your fingers like this in line with the axis of lathe, lay them gently on the surface and just let them rest on there and move this back and forth like that, you're not pressing in, you're just running your hand over that. It is absolutely amazing the detail that you can feel in this finish, and it is screwed up badly. There's a big, right here, there's a big flat spot. There's a high spot right there. This is pretty good on down here. There's a little wobble a little bit. Up here, there's a flat spot right in there. And I'm kind of losing it right there because I'm getting off. But I can tell all of that by just doing this, and I can read it very easily, very distinctly. Before I do this, I would need to clean these wheels, because we just used them on a piece with wax, and there's wax on the wheels, and I don't want to impress that wax in there. So I'm just going to kind of like turn that wheel and take that wax off of there. Mineral spirits is good. We'll take it off real well, because I don't want to deposit it back into the pores of this piece. This happens to be an open grain piece, so I can put wax in there, and it could screw up things in the future when we go to put some finish in there. Now, as I set this up, excuse me, that's the dust. And as I set this up, it's very important that I get these wheels right at the widest part of this curve. If I had the wheels down here, they would try to climb uphill as this piece turned. And the center steady would start doing one of these numbers, because they would climb as far as they could before the center steady would overcome and pull them back, and then they'd just keep doing that. And if I had them on this side of in opposite, in reverse. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, it needs to come up just a little bit more, right like that. And again, bring this one up here so it just touches. Bring this one down here and put some pressure on it and check and make sure we're good. We are good. And here we go. You're using a boring bar. You go in, you're probably going to get some vibration at some place. That is a harmonic of the system. When we weld up our boring bars, if you look at that boring bar, you'll see that the welds on the top of the bar and the welds on the bottom of the bar are not in the same place. That's intentional. And they're random on both sides. That's also intentional. We do not space those out on a regular space basis because we don't want to create harmonics in the system. So we're trying to fight that as much as we can. But still, when you put a boring bar in here, it's supported here, it's supported here, there's a harmonic. At some point, there's going to be like, if the distance from here, from the support to the cutter, is 1/2 of what the distance is from this support to that support, you're going to have some vibration right there. If that's a problem for you, there are several things you can do about it. You can turn the speed up or down. You can move one part of the system and change that relationship. There's a lot of things you can do. Usually you can just power right on through it. It doesn't make any doggone difference at all. I've heard people say, oh, vibration is very, very dangerous. I don't know of any danger associated with a vibration. It's noisy, it's annoying, but it hasn't hurt anyone that I know of. Also, there's a difference between vibration and chatter, okay? Vibration is in the system. Chatter is a matter of the cutter coming down here and then skipping up here and taking a cut, coming down, skipping up here and taking a cut. That's chatter. You know what a chatter tool is and you know what it does to the piece. And you can have that happen in the system. That is not a good thing. It's still not dangerous, but actually if you look at that piece that's split in half over there and you get down near the bottom, you can feel some places where there was some chatter existing in that system when that was done. What I wanted to show you here is how we go about this, getting this cleaned up, and I'm just going to kind of clean up that outside edge of that first, and then I'm going to try to pick up this cut right here. I don't want to take this whole thing because I got quite a lot of wood to remove, so I'm just going to try to get rid of some of it real quick like. And then we're going to use the calibrated eyeball. There you go. And we're going to go in here, and by looking down with both eyes open and looking at the gouge here and the outside of the vessel, if I get this right as I come around like this, I should be able to follow the curve pretty well. And I think I'm losing a little bit, but now it's getting too heavy for me. Take a little excess wood off of there. And I'm going to come in and use a different kind of a cut here. This one can be tricky. If you keep the gouge handle low so that you got an angle up there, you're pretty good. But if you let the gouge get like this, you will get a catch. And at this point where this is that thin and that delicate, you're probably going to lose the piece. Once again, I'm getting little curly chips. Now, it feels like oh, that's a knot, that's why. Now I take see, I can go into about right there, I'm good, but right there on in, I'm a little bit thick. Still thick. Now another thing that I sometimes do, since we have the chuck locked on, is turn it backwards. And if you run it backwards, it is possible to pick up this cut right about here and then push it on in this way and go around that corner to a certain extent here. I've got too much wood. Okay. So you can do that, or you can wait until you get in there with your Monroe cutter. I won't use the CA glue where I expect it to do a permanent job. If I need to put any kind of glue on this permanently, and I can see I've got a little bit of a crack right in here, if I need to put glue on it, what I'll do is mix up epoxy. Now, I asked the guys at the Linder Conservation Lab, I says, well, what do you guys use? Because they have, I don't know, tens of thousands of objects of all kinds that they have to deal with. And he goes over to this cabinet. He opens up this cabinet, and there's like 148 kinds of you know, all kinds of adhesives, glues, and whatnot. Well, he says, whatever needs to be used on that particular object. I said, well, you know, that isn't going to work for me. I mean, if I can only use one or two, what would you recommend? Oh boy, I don't know. Don't know what to say. And so I pressed him. I pressed him. I said, yeah, it's got to be. You know, he says, well, I would guess that if you wanted one good all-around glue, that you should get some optical quality epoxy. But what I do is to thicken epoxy is I use wood dust. I would use, in this case, a light colored wood dust. And I take fine dust from sanding of, you know, I have a jar of walnut dust, a jar of cherry dust, a jar of maple dust, you know, so on and so forth. And I pick whichever color that is most appropriate for the piece and the place that I'm using it. You can also mix in artist pigments if you want any color of epoxy. And remember, the pigments are permanent if you buy the right artist pigments, if you buy good quality stuff. By the way, while I'm thinking of it, we're going to talk about this later, but I could forget. If you start using artist acrylics and you go to the store, the art supply store, to buy artist acrylics, and all of the colors are the same price, don't even waste your money. The good quality artist acrylics are all different prices according to what the pigment is in them. So anyway, now you can see that I'm not going to spend any more time on this. You see what the technique is here to get that far. To go from here on in, the next little bit around the corner, I would probably use this. This is a scraper with, I think you can see that this is, I'm not going to take the tape off, but this is a round end on this with a little cut back here. So I go in here and I can rest. This part is not sharp, but this is. So I can rest this part against the inside of that, and as I go on around with it like this, I can go all the way inside here right to there. I can also do that with the Monroe if I want to set it up, but it's so much easier to just do it like this and then take the Monroe and finish it out. Now, when you go down the inside of this piece with a Monroe, it's going to leave a kind of like a little scallop finish. You can see that in that piece there. Further on down in where we didn't go in with a scraper and straighten that out. And I'll be right back. If you get a scraper, a teardrop scraper, this happens to be the small one that goes on our little boring bars. If you get the larger size teardrop scraper, which we have when they're in stock, and I can get them, which I can't right now, then you put that on that boring bar and you go on down inside with that scraper after you're done getting it to the final thickness. One very important point though, when you go inside the piece with a scraper, you do not use that guide pin. I did not talk about that guide pin, and I should. This little pin that we use on here is a guide pin. It is not a fulcrum. And if you try to use this as a fulcrum, you've got this bar out here and you got like 3 feet out here, 6 inches here. Just a little bit of force is multiplied tremendously right there, and you're going to destroy your piece. Don't even think of it as a fulcrum. Think of it as a guide pin, a stabilizer. That's all you use it for. You just keep the bar against there as you're going in, and it will keep the bar from moving sideways, which it will always want to do because there's more wood here than there is over there, or the wood is dense, more dense here than it is over there, or there's a knot over here, or whatever. The bar is always going to want to go back and forth. This just stops that from happening, but don't try to use it as a force multiplier. What I'm going to do now is pass this around, and if I can find the wrench to get it out of the chuck with. Excuse me. That's why I don't like the doggone dust, because I have a problem with that. So remember, you're going to lay your hand on here, and you're going to just gently, just lay it on there and gently run it up and down. See what you can read on that piece now.